Hi folks, this is a video about something extremely important that many people are completely unaware of. It's about the events that led up to the March 2020 lockdown in Britain. Sadly, the British public have shown very little interest in what caused the lockdown. I urge you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say. What happened in March 2020 was an attack on our democracy. The attack was initiated by the Chinese Communist Party, then carried forward by unions, mostly from the British public sector. Marxist unions unilaterally tried to impose a lockdown on Britain, and then the government caved in a desperate attempt to retain power and deliver Brexit. In other videos and in my pandemic trilogy of books, I've already divulged a huge amount of detail about what happened in March 2020. In this video, I'm going to summarise that information while sharing some incredible new findings. Most incredible of all, I'll reveal that the March 2020 attack was not only an attempt to force our elected government into the lockdown. The attack also targeted the very heart of our democracy, the electoral process itself. Nobody in the media has seen fit to tell the British public anything of what went on during this most scandalous time. Let's cast our minds back. Britain's COVID debacle began with events 5,000 miles away, when the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, sent Wuhan into lockdown. The date was January the 23rd, 2020. Around the world, pretty much everybody immediately made a false assumption that the Wuhan lockdown was some sort of health measure. In fact, the Wuhan lockdown never had anything to do with health. In my book, The Truth About the Wuhan Lockdown, I've revealed what really went on in China. The CCP initially played down the threat from COVID-19 because the virus was mild. But the public in Wuhan didn't trust the authorities and became hysterical. The city's inhabitants wanted the government to do more to protect them. People were spontaneously self-isolating, undermining the government's stay calm approach. Indeed, an open mutiny was brewing. On January the 22nd, the day before the Wuhan lockdown, a journalist working for the region's main newspaper did the unthinkable. He called for a change of political leadership. In a post on Chinese social media, he blazed that the region must immediately change out its commanders. The post was shared wildly online, accompanied by furious mockery of the Chinese Communist Party. Xi Jinping, the president of China, responded by slamming Wuhan into lockdown. The decision was a no-brainer for him. He was trying to regain control by squashing the unrest and giving the city's inhabitants what they wanted. From day one, the Wuhan lockdown was a fake health policy based on mass hysteria and political cynicism. So how on earth did the policy spread worldwide? Well, obviously one reason was that the mass hysteria that began in Wuhan soon spilled out of China, engulfing almost the whole world during February and March 2020. It was the first ever episode of global hysteria. Another reason why lockdowns spread worldwide was that the Chinese Communist Party promoted the policy abroad. When the international community placed travel restrictions on Chinese people, Xi became angry. In an act of demented retaliation, he bombarded the world with fear-mongering and pro-lockdown propaganda. The bombardment was an info attack, aiming to inflict economic damage on China's rivals by bludgeoning them with lockdowns. To this end, Xi leveraged China's overseas investments in the media, academia, politics and more. Meanwhile, CCP bots stormed social media, calling for lockdowns and shaming anyone who disagreed with the policy. COVID hysteria surged worldwide, fanned by a hurricane of disinformation. A third reason why lockdowns spread was that the global panic triggered a tsunami of union unrest. International union federations agitated for COVID restrictions. The agitation then cascaded down to national union federations, then down to specific unions. As unions took the law into their own hands, trying to close down workplaces all over the world, politicians responded by caving in and implementing lockdowns, just as Xi had responded to the civil unrest in Wuhan. Lockdowns were a political spin operation by governments desperate to maintain an illusion of control while countries were spontaneously being closed down by unions. Nowhere was this dynamic clearer than in Britain, my own country. The British government's initial plan was to pursue herd immunity, allowing the virus to spread harmlessly through the young and healthy population. The idea was for the public to build up mass immunity as quickly as possible while vulnerable people stayed out of harm's way for the shortest possible time. On March the 3rd, Prime Minister Boris Johnson boasted that he had shook hands with everybody in a hospital where there were coronavirus patients. He wanted Britain to keep calm and carry on. Unfortunately, Britain's unions had other ideas. As I disclosed in my book, The Corona Panic Debacle, unions waged a nationwide assault on our government in March 2020. Health unions demanded PPE in hospitals, with one major union warning that staff would strike over the issue. In at least one hospital, staff are known to have participated in a walkout. Rail unions were threatening to take action to protect their members. The main academic union was formally calling for universities to close. Legal unions were staging numerous actions trying to unilaterally shut down courts. The Union for Professional Footballers was agitating for matches to be cancelled. The footballing authorities caved in and postponed all forthcoming matches against the government's advice. Education unions were agitating for all schools to be closed. The Civil Service Union was demanding the right to work from home. Unite, the largest union in the country with over 1 million members, was calling for a lockdown. The TUC, a federation of 48 unions, was encouraging its members to hand in Section 44 letters to the effect that the workplace was unsafe, thereby stoking a massive work-from-home migration against government advice. Later, the TUC boasted that they forced the government into the furlough scheme. The National Union of Journalists was also involved in lobbying for furlough. And it is likely that unions were trying to shut Parliament down too. Labour, the political party which represents Britain's unions, was demanding a lockdown. The government's capitulation came in 4 phases. First, on March the 13th, came the ban on mass gatherings. Johnson openly admitted that there was no scientific reason for the ban. He said the only reason for the U-turn was that he wanted to relieve a burden on the public sector. A public sector that we know was agitating against the herd immunity policy. Furthermore, we know that numerous public events were already being unilaterally cancelled by the organisers in the second week of March. The government was losing control. On March the 16th came an even bigger capitulation. Johnson abandoned the herd immunity policy and started advising social distancing, a complete nonsense policy. Neil Ferguson's dodgy research was wheeled out to spin the U-turn, and in the process Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, the government's chief science advisors, reversed their previous advice, which they had spent months preparing. At this point there was still no legal lockdown. Johnson was merely advising social distancing, the same as Sweden's policy. He also stated clearly that the British government wanted to keep schools open. Unfortunately, the largest education union in Britain, the National Education Union, was determined to defy the PM. In an open letter, the NEU's co-leaders Kevin Courtney and Mary Bousted warned of unilateral schools closures if the government didn't close every school in the country. Courtney has since boasted that the NEU participated in what he called a big action in March 2020. The NEU has also boasted that their stance in March 2020 was, and I quote, that schools should be closed before March the 23rd at the latest, and if not, that NEU members should refuse to return to work. Let us be very clear about this. The NEU blackmailed the government. On March the 18th, the government capitulated and announced that all schools would close. We know the reason why. A Dominic Cummings WhatsApp message on March the 17th spoke of head teachers defying the government by unilaterally closing schools in London. Cummings issued a warning to his colleagues. We must get ahead. Those 4 words are damning. Let me repeat them. We must get ahead. The government pretended to lead schools closures that were happening anyway, and it was the same throughout the economy. Unilateral closures driven by unions, with the government getting out in front of the parade and pretending to lead it. The day the schools closed, March the 20th, Johnson asked other public venues to close. He could hardly endorse the idea of adults continuing to congregate when children were being deprived of the same right. With the schools closed and most of the economy shut down, Britain was in effect in lockdown. Indeed, the economy could hardly have functioned anyway without the schools open. Someone had to look after the kids. The extraction of so many working parents from the economy would have made life very difficult for most workplaces, with or without a lockdown. But there was still no legally enforced lockdown. Johnson was still forlornly saying he hoped he would see his mum on Mother's Day, which fell on March the 22nd. Alas, on the day of March the 22nd, Johnson's own cabinet turned on him. According to reports, he faced a full-scale cabinet mutiny if he didn't lock London down. He caved in again, announcing on March the 23rd that the whole of Britain would go into a legally enforced lockdown. Within 3 weeks, Johnson had gone from boasting about shaking hands in a hospital where there were coronavirus patients to banning an entire country from leaving the house. People often accuse me of saying that Britain's lockdown was driven solely by unions, but I've never said that. Unions couldn't have forced the government into a lockdown unless the public supported the policy. No government is going to commit a ludicrous communist crime to cover up an assault by unions unless the public wants the government to commit the crime. Sadly, 93% of the public wanted a lockdown. The same global panic that caused lockdowns around the world was rampant in Britain, and so was the CCP lockdown propaganda that stoked the global panic. For example, when Johnson was pursuing herd immunity, his Twitter feed was besieged by CCP bots calling him a butcher, a murderer and a fascist. The same happened to me too. When I was defending freedom in March 2020, warning Britain not to lock down, creepy little anonymous bots came crawling over my account, vilifying me for wanting to stay a free man. Britain's mainstream media was also pumping out COVID fear-mongering, a fact that is doubly concerning when we know that the CCP was flexing its muscles in the overseas media. In fact, there is evidence that the CCP was paying for lockdown propaganda in the most astonishing of outlets, Britain's leading conservative newspaper. In early 2020, The Telegraph is alleged to have published more than 50 articles paid for by the Chinese Communist Party. Many of the articles have now been deleted from the newspaper's website. I don't know about you, but I remember being dismayed that The Telegraph was promoting communist barbarism in my country when our freedom was hanging by a thread. Throughout Britain's so-called free press, almost nobody defended freedom. Journalists, writers, media personalities and other influencers either kept their heads down while our rights were being annihilated, or worse, they actively demanded the atrocity. Some prominent media figures raged against the herd immunity policy, relentlessly blitzing the public with predictions of doom. I find it very difficult to believe that these media figures weren't being paid by Britain's enemies, whether by the Chinese Communist Party or other hostile regimes such as Putin's in Russia. Among the ranks of the media traitors there were many trusted conservatives, journalists and writers who had made a living out of defending freedom, but were now trying to destroy our way of life. After the herd immunity U-turn, there was another wave of media fear-mongering. This time it seems the mainstream media was paid by the British government to promote the lockdown. Flocks of journalists suddenly started shrieking their support for the policy. The Telegraph participated in this new outburst too, for example with Alison Pearson shrieking at people for going to the pub and Camilla Tominay shrieking at people for going to the park. The Telegraph's cartoonist Bob Moran is another who was enlisted in the outburst, helping to promote the lockdown by drawing cartoons that made social distancing seem patriotic. The British media behaved absolutely disgustingly in March 2020. They failed our country, they failed our democracy, and they failed their profession. The British government U-turned, abandoning the sensible scientific policy of herd immunity, thereby plunging the entire country into a pointless communist nightmare without a single UK journalist explaining why the U-turn had happened. Instead, the journalists were paid for their complicity. And their complicity lasted for the whole 2 years. Yes, I realise that some of the journalists who supported the lockdown in March 2020 went on to call themselves lockdown skeptics weeks or months later. But as I've explained in my book My Road to Freedom, none of them ever told the truth about what had happened at the start. None of them ever explained that the lockdown was a fake health policy which communist China had wanted to inflict on us to destroy our economy. None of them explained that unions had defied the government's advice by unilaterally shutting Britain down. None of them explained that Johnson's own cabinet had betrayed him in March 2020. None of them explained that the herd immunity U-turn was a spin operation to cover up the union unrest. None of them explained that they themselves or their employers had been paid to support the lockdown at the start. The public were terrified and bewildered. They needed to hear the truth. They needed to be told exactly what had happened in March 2020, that the lockdown was not only completely pointless, but an act of deliberate vandalism against our country, led by a government that was desperately clinging on to power by paying for lockdown propaganda in the media. Instead, the lockdown skeptic journalists withheld the full truth from us. And in the process, they had the nerve to pretend they cared about our freedom. They were like Ian Huntley, the murderer who covered up his own crimes while pretending to help search for the victims. And it's worse. After March 2020, unions continued blackmailing the British government for 2 years while the fake lockdown skeptic journalists continued covering up what was going on. In summer 2020, the leading rail union threatened to strike if the government didn't mandate masks on trains. The government caved in. Shortly afterwards, the leading retail union fought for masks to be mandated in shops. The government caved in again. Meanwhile, the largest union, Unite, was demanding masks and other lunatic COVID measures as a condition of reopening workplaces. The government caved in again. Later that summer, the government announced that all shielding advice would be paused and the furlough scheme would be scrapped. However, in the autumn, the TUC responded by orchestrating another nationwide campaign of union unrest, spearheaded by the civil service union threatening to strike if they weren't allowed to continue working from home. The NEU was running amok again too, and ultimately Johnson was pushed into the second lockdown. Then over Christmas 2020, the British Medical Association pushed the government into a new raft of restrictions. Throughout this whole period, not one of the so-called lockdown skeptics in the media saw fit to tell the public about the campaign of union unrest that had been boiling since March 2020. On January the 4th, 2021, came the most scandalous episode of the whole debacle. The NEU orchestrated an illegal strike, which stopped the government from reopening England's primary schools. Later that evening, the government suddenly announced a new lockdown to cover up the strike. Again, not one of the so-called lockdown skeptics in the media saw fit to tell the public what had happened. Our freedom was being abolished again because some Marxist teachers were refusing to do their jobs, but instead of telling us what was going on, the fake lockdown skeptic journalists helped the government cover up the strike. Otherwise, the events of January the 4th would have led like a trail back to what happened in March 2020. Even Peter Hitchens and Laura Perrins, the sole media figures who had been against the first lockdown, were now helping the government cover up January the 4th, presumably because their employers had been paid to help spin the first lockdown and no one involved in the crime wanted to have an honest discussion about what had happened. As a result of the January the 4th cover-up, the children remained at the mercy of their Marxist teachers, who then refused to return to school unless the children wore masks in the classrooms. The government caved in again, sending the kids back in March to be abused for 3 months by their psychotic teachers. Meanwhile, the fake lockdown skeptic journalists wrung their hands about the fate of the kids without telling the public that the teachers were still blackmailing the government. The campaign group Us For Them, which is closely associated with the Telegraph, also joined in with the cover-up, pretending to care about the kids, while in fact helping the Marxist teachers get away with the January the 4th strike and the ensuing child abuse. As the year wore on, Britain was gripped by vaccine mania, with the government attempting to spin their way out of the whole debacle by using mass vaccination to reassure the public. When teaching unions pushed for a vaccine rollout in schools, the government abandoned the official scientific recommendation against the policy, and the school kids were vaccinated for no reason other than to continue appeasing their deranged Marxist teachers. Meanwhile, the fake lockdown skeptic journalists, including Us For Them, continued covering up the January the 4th strike and the rest of the union assault on Britain. And still it went on. In the winter of 2021, there was another flurry of lunacy as unions again pushed for masks on public transport and in shops, and the government caved in again. There was also pressure from the BMA and NHS Confederation to bring in mandatory COVID passes in public venues, and yet, you guessed it, the government caved in again. Then, in the new year, the school kids were forced into masks in classrooms again because the government feared another mass walkout by the teachers. Mercifully, at this stage, the whole debacle was juddering to a halt. Johnson had threatened to jab the entire NHS workforce. If the threat had been carried through, the health service would have been decimated because so many members of staff would have quit rather than take the jab. Johnson's threat worked. It spooked the NHS. Suddenly doctors and nurses were telling us that the vaccine wasn't necessary for them. And so the rug was pulled out from under the unions. They could hardly continue running amok when the NHS was in effect telling us that COVID wasn't so bad after all. The kids were unmasked, the COVID passes were scrapped, and in February 2022, our freedom was restored in full. I repeat, for the entire 2 years, the fake lockdown skeptic journalists covered up the union assault that was being waged on Britain. They covered up the assault because it had been going on since March 2020, and no one in the media wanted to talk about March 2020. No one wanted to talk about the CCP-funded lockdown propaganda that was published in the media, for example in the Telegraph, or the unions unilaterally shutting workplaces down, or the government abandoning herd immunity, or Whitty and Valence selling their souls, or Neil Ferguson's research being wheeled out to spin the herd immunity U-turn, or the media being paid by the British government to spin the U-turn, or Johnson's cabinet going into a full-on mutiny which finally drove Britain into a legally enforced lockdown. The entire media was complicit from day one. One word of honesty from any of them, and the debacle couldn't have lasted 5 minutes, never mind 2 years. If the public had understood what was going on, our rights would instantly have been restored in full or never confiscated in the first place. Stop fawning over the fake lockdown skeptic journalists who got you locked up, were paid for it, and then pranced around like Ian Huntley wringing their hands about freedom while in fact covering up what had happened. Stop fawning over the fake lockdown skeptic journalists who covered up January the 4th and helped the NEU abuse kids. The fake lockdown skeptic journalists were never on our side. Start facing up to the attack that was committed against our democracy in March 2020, an attack that lasted 2 years with the participation of the entire media from day one until the end. The idea that the Chinese Communist Party, the media, the Labour Party and unelected unions could force our elected Conservative government into a 2-year communist atrocity is bad enough. However, I'm sorry to say, the crime was even more profound. At the start of this video, I noted that our democracy was attacked in March 2020 in the most direct way possible. The electoral process itself was attacked. You may not remember, but in May 2020, we were meant to have local elections and mayoral elections. The Conservative government was riding a wave of popularity. They had won a landslide in the general election in December 2019, and then on January the 31st, they had formally withdrawn Britain from the EU, pending a transition period of 1 year. The withdrawal came 3 years after the British public had voted for Brexit. Those 3 years had been fraught, with many Remainers disgracefully trying to overturn the 2016 referendum result. The Labour Party, the Lib Dems and the Greens, plus a sizable cohort of Conservatives, had formed a Remain bloc in Parliament, seeking to undermine the Leave vote by any legal means possible. When January the 31st came, Britain breathed a sigh of relief, because the practical process of leaving the EU could finally begin. The local elections in May 2020 were an opportunity for the national government to consolidate its agenda at the local level, with a strong Conservative performance likely given the recent general election victory and the confirmation of Brexit. The emergence of COVID was unsettling, but government policy in early March ought to have provided reassurance. The pursuit of herd immunity would have meant life carrying on normally for the vast majority. But die-hard Remainers and Socialists had quite another agenda. They spied an opportunity too. By causing as much disruption as possible during the COVID pandemic, they could not only damage the government and thwart the practical process of leaving the EU, there was also the prospect of thwarting any Conservative gains in the local elections. And what better way to thwart those gains than by getting the elections cancelled? So that is what Remainers and Socialists did. What I'm going to recount to you is, in my opinion, one of the most shocking episodes of the entire COVID debacle. When the Union assault on Britain was gathering steam in the second week of March 2020, the upcoming local elections were targeted too. Despite the government pursuing herd immunity, there was a concerted attempt by numerous factions to cancel the local elections so that Socialists and Remainers could retain power at the local level. We have elections in this country so that the public can decide who governs us. If people start trying to cancel elections so that they themselves can retain power, those people are waging a coup against our democratic system and against the British public. That is what happened in March 2020, a drastic escalation of the preceding 3-year assault on democracy. Against the advice of the government, Remainers and Socialists in key institutions agitated for the postponement of the local elections. The assault on your right to vote was spearheaded by a body called the Electoral Commission. Set up by Tony Blair in 1997, the stated purpose of the Commission was to ensure that political parties stuck to the rules around campaigning. However, Conservatives soon started accusing Blair's new Quango of being in bed with the Labour Party. And later, after the EU referendum, one of the leading Leave campaign groups accused the Commission of a grotesque anti-Brexit bias. When you look at the board of the Electoral Commission at that time, the accusation hardly looks far-fetched. Out of 10 board members, 6 of them were publicly pro-EU, and of the other 4, 3 were Labour-appointed bureaucrats, and the other was a member of the SNP. One newspaper reported that nearly half of the Commission's board members criticised the Brexit campaign or called for the referendum result to be overturned. And then came March 2020. On March the 12th, the Electoral Commission called on the government to cancel England's upcoming local elections. The Commission's chief executive wrote to the government urging them to rethink the existing strategy of continuing with the polls. Obviously, it's quite a big deal when an independent body whose remit is to protect the integrity of elections is suggesting that a vote should be postponed. At the same time, two other bodies involved in the local elections were backing calls for a postponement: the Association of Electoral Administrators and the Local Government Association. These unions were significant voices because the local elections couldn't be run without administrators or without the participation of local authorities who provide venues and staff. If the people involved in running the elections didn't want to run the elections, Johnson's government was obviously under significant pressure. And there was more. The Labour Party was likewise calling for a postponement of the local elections, and indeed the party was taking matters into its own hands. The General Secretary of Labour at that time was a lady called Jenny Formby. Formby describes herself as a socialist and trade unionist. On March the 13th, she wrote to local party branches advising them to suspend campaigning ahead of the polls. Let me clarify that. In effect, the Labour Party unilaterally withdrew from the May 2020 local elections, trying to force through a postponement. Furthermore, Labour also cancelled its own special leadership conference, which was scheduled for April the 4th, and meanwhile, 4 political parties are known to have cancelled their spring conferences: the Lib Dems, Plaid Cymru, the Green Party and Welsh Labour. All this was happening, I repeat, while the government was trying to pursue herd immunity. And it was happening in parallel with the wider union assault that was gathering steam in Britain, an assault that was being spearheaded by Labour. We can reasonably assume that behind the scenes the Local Government Association and the Association of Electoral Administrators were threatening to mutiny. Perhaps the Electoral Commission was making threats too. The Conservatives were faced with the prospect of participating in local elections that were run by no one and contested by no other mainstream parties. Elections without administrators and without the full spectrum of contestants are elections without democratic legitimacy and therefore are not really elections at all. In effect, your right to vote in May 2020 was unilaterally confiscated by Remainers and Socialists who knew that the British public didn't want them to retain power. On the morning of March the 13th, the government was still insisting that the local elections would go ahead in May. However, by the end of the day, the government had caved in, announcing that the elections would be postponed for a year. The evening of March the 13th was also when Johnson announced a ban on mass gatherings. The reason he gave for that ban, relieving a burden on the public sector, might as well be said about the postponement of the local elections too, in more ways than one. The burden of an upcoming electoral defeat was lifted from the shoulders of Socialists and Remainers throughout Britain's local government, and for good measure, the government even promised to compensate the local authorities for the preparatory work that they had already done around the elections. I guess it was a case of no bad deed goes unrewarded. What happened in March 2020 is an absolute outrage. Not only was the public deprived of our right to leave the house thanks to a deranged attack by the Chinese Communist Party, the Labour Party, unions, the media, a Conservative government that caved in, we were also deprived of our right to vote in the local elections. As it turned out, the Conservatives still made gains when the rescheduled elections were held in May 2021, but the gains were moderate. And whatever happened a year later does not excuse the outrage of a public sector trying to overturn the advice of the nation's chief scientists in March 2020. Furthermore, in the wider picture, we have to reflect on what we missed out on as an electorate when Britain's public sector refused to cooperate with the herd immunity policy. We voted for a Conservative government that would secure our borders, boost our economy, uphold common sense, promote conservative values, enhance our freedom and protect our democracy. Johnson was going to oversee a massive programme of infrastructure spending and house building, and we would have handed the Conservatives the same resounding mandate in the local elections in May 2020. We may even have had a Conservative mayor in London. Instead, we had 2 years of demented COVID restrictions triggered by 2 years of unchallenged union unrest, shaking our country to ruin. 2 years of economic destruction and human rights violations, with the future of Britain stifled in the most visceral way. Young people deprived of an education and forcibly masked by communist nutters. We had illegal immigrants pouring across our borders while the existing population languished at home and the housing crisis worsened. Almost nothing was built. Almost nothing was achieved, except a transfer of free money to people who stood in their front gardens, banging their pots and pans and spouting communist slogans. Serious health conditions went untreated, so that for years to come the young will die in greater numbers than they would have done. We ran up a £400 billion bill as a country, and an inflation crisis too. And all of this thanks to a COVID debacle that never should have happened. Boris Johnson was a hostage PM, hemmed in by mutineers in his own party and throughout the public sector. In the end, he was ousted, chased out by the same forces that chased him into the COVID debacle. Unions then went on to launch a further wave of disruption to secure pay rises that would protect them against the economic consequences of their own actions during COVID. A disgusting campaign of socialist malevolence from March 2020 to the present. And the final insult? Labour are poised to win a landslide in the next general election. Socialist nutters who hate our country stand to be rewarded for waging a coup against our democracy. I do not accept any of this happening, and nor should you. I do not think the British public would vote for socialist governance if they knew the full truth about what happened in March 2020 and beyond. I do not think they would accept the role played by the Conservative establishment either. No one in the Conservative Party or the media stood up to the socialists, even as the socialists trashed our economy and abused kids. A monstrous 2-year union-demic covered up by fake Conservative scoundrels. Without exception, Conservative politicians were dire, a disgrace to the party of Margaret Thatcher. And without exception, the Conservative media were dire, helping the politicians capitulate to the socialists and then having the nerve to lecture us about freedom, even as they helped cover up the capitulation, which was ongoing and lasted 2 years. Let us remember that the Telegraph not only took money from the CCP to promote the lockdown while the British government was pursuing herd immunity, the Telegraph also helped the British government spin the herd immunity U-turn, and then the Telegraph covered up the entire 2-year union-demic, including the January the 4th attack on kids. The Mail newspaper helped the government promote the lockdown at the start and then covered up the entire union-demic, including the January the 4th attack on kids. The Conservative Woman helped the government promote the lockdown at the start and then covered up the entire union-demic, including the January the 4th attack on kids. Us for Them, the fake campaign group, which was launched in May 2020 in close association with the Telegraph, covered up the entire union-demic, including the January the 4th attack on kids. Unlocked, the fake campaign group which was launched in summer 2020, covered up the entire union-demic, including the January the 4th attack on kids. And what about the two biggest so-called alternative Conservative political parties? Well, Reclaim waved the lockdown through at the start and then covered up the entire union-demic, including the January the 4th attack on kids. And Reform waved the lockdown through at the start and then covered up the entire union-demic, including the January the 4th attack on kids. And what about everyone's favourite Conservative broadcaster, GB News? Even though GB News didn't exist until the summer of 2021, every single one of their presenters existed, and they either zealously supported the lockdown at the start or they waved the policy through. And now, of course, one of those presenters is Boris Johnson himself. A notable fact about GB News is that one of its main investors is a man called Paul Marshall. Marshall also owns the Conservative website Unheard. Unheard helped the government promote the lockdown at the start and then covered up the entire union-demic, including the January the 4th attack on kids. If Unheard took money from the British government to help spin the herd immunity U-turn, that would explain why Marshall's new vehicle, GB News, hasn't gone near the whole topic with a barge pole. Like every other major Conservative media outlet in Britain, GB News has steadfastly avoided discussing what went on in March 2020, including the union assault, the herd immunity U-turn, the media's role in spinning the U-turn, and the 2-year union-demic, including the January the 4th attack on kids. An absolutely dire showing from the entire Conservative establishment, including politicians and the media. How dare they let Marxists get away with steamrolling our country and abusing kids? No, get away with it is not strong enough a phrase. The Conservative establishment actively colluded in Marxist crimes. We now have a Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, who agitated for all 3 lockdowns when he was head of the Parliamentary Health and Social Care Committee. We have a Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who oversaw the ruinous furlough scheme and supported all 3 lockdowns. And we have Boris Johnson back in the media, helping cover up a demented Marxist assault which they all colluded in. They and their media mates preach to us about conservatism while in effect handing power to a Labour Party which successfully waged a coup against our democracy. The coup began in March 2020 and is now almost complete. I urge decent people in Britain to demand justice. I know that some of you supported the lockdown at the start. Perhaps you even supported it for 2 years. I hope that what I've now told you will make you realise that you made a bad mistake. We all make mistakes. Your responsibility now is to acknowledge your mistake and make amends. Tell people what really happened. Tell the kids what really happened. The kids are the future of our democracy. Let them grow up in a country where people know that the lockdown was never anything but a fake health policy cynically imposed on Wuhan by the Chinese Communist Party and then cynically exported to the rest of the world by the Chinese Communist Party. Let them grow up in a country where unions don't get to hijack the government when there's a virus, demanding free money to hide while imposing lunatic restrictions on other people's lives. A country where no government capitulates to such an attack, spinning the demands into policy and pretending it's for health reasons. A country where an elected government is given the grace to govern instead of being assailed by Marxists or their accomplices, such as the Remainers who likewise ran amok in March 2020. A country where mobs of political agitators can't cancel local elections because they think they might lose them. This is Britain, for goodness sake, the home of democracy. A country where democratic values are cherished, not buried in lies.